I wanted to talk about, there's a minig among some to say Shir Hashirim on Friday night or Friday afternoon. The Sephardim, I think, are the ones who adhere to the minig the most from everybody. And your average Sephardi shul, for sure a Syrian shul, I don't know about every stream of Sephardim, but your average Sephardi shul, as part of their Friday night davening, they say Shir Hashirim. Some of them, the Chazan leads it. Some of them, they sing it all together in a group. Some of them say it before B'Mem Adlikin. Some of them say it after B'Mem Adlikin. By the Chassidim, there's such a minute to say it. I wanted to go into all the different, various minhagim of when we say Shir Hashirim, how to say Shir Hashirim. But then I came across a letter from the son of the name Elimelech, and he changed my mind. I never saw this letter before, but I'll read you a little bit from it. And maybe I'm not going to talk about that. He says, as follows. This was printed in some editions of the name Elimelech. He says, this is from the son of the name Elimelech, Rav Elazar Lipa, the son who published actually the first edition of the name Elimelech. I think he might have been the one who wrote it also. So he says as follows, Mechtave Higiyan, he's writing about a letter that he received from a chassid who wanted to know some of the minhagim of the court. He says, Mechtave Higiyani, I showed it to my father, the name Elimelech, whose yard site was today actually, the Sham Shavan Aliyah. So, Tesamar Saraisav in his Dazdea, Ivarav Baraisa, Shiesh Boilam, Shtosim, Vidivri Avalim, Upesiyim Ke'elu. Says the name Elimelech, my father, got very disturbed and upset and disappointed when he saw that people are busy with Shush Shtosim, he says. From the question this Shail was asking, it sounds like the reason why this person, the Shail, comes to Tzadikim is not to learn from their actions, not to come for that. All you want to learn from the Tzadikim, he says, is you see what their movements are, their motions are. If you clap like the Rebbe, then you're a chassid. You stamp like the Rebbe, you dance like the Rebbe. That's all you want to know about. He says, it would be better, he's quoting the name of Elimelech, it would be better if you didn't even write in. I'm going to answer you a little bit because of the kavod. He says, someone who asks, is miras elu elizulasim? Should I sing this miras or another miras? Should I say Shir Hashirim now? Should I say it later? All of the shtosim like this. So I wasn't left with much options. The Name Elimelech is writing very clearly that this type of shmooze, when to say it, when not to say it, how to say it, is like he says, shtar shtosim ke'elu, should not be discussed. So I decided, instead of talking about when exactly to say it and who says it when, we'll talk about Shir Hashirim as a whole a little bit, and one very, very nice teher, how Shir Hashirim came to be associated with Friday night. So I want to start with this. There's quite a few Gemaras to start with, as a background over here. Now, the Mishnah in Yedayim, it's a famous Mishnah. The Mishnah in Yedayim, Perek Beis, Mishnah Daled, the Mishnah says as follows, Shir Hashirim v'Kayheles, B'tamana Seyedayim. Shir Hashirim, the Megillah of Shir Hashirim and Kayheles, are Metama the hands. Rav Yehuda Omer, Shir Hashirim, Metama Seyedayim, v'Kayheles Machlekes. Rabbi Yossi is a third shita, comes along Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says as follows, Rabbi Akiva, Chas v'shalom, that there's even a debate about Shir Hashirim. He says, Le'nechlak Adam Yisrael al Shir Hashirim, Shleit Tatam al Yadayim. There was never a person who said that Shir Hashirim should not be Matam Yadayim. Dahainu ayi, that Shir Hashirim is not from the Kisvei HaKodesh. She'en kala ilum kulei kedai, because the whole world is not worthy. Ki yoim she'nasan she'nitan by Shir Hashirim Yisrael, like the day that Shir Hashirim was given to Klal Yisrael. She'kala ksuvim kodesh. All ksuvim are kodesh. V'Shir Hashirim kodesh kedashim. But Shir Hashirim is kodesh kedashim. It's an even more of an elevated stature. Lemnechelku, says Rabbi Akiva, if there was a machlekes about something from the Kisvei HaKodesh, lemnechelku ela al Kayheles. The only machlekes is about Kayheles. Okay? Amar Rav Yochanan ben Yeshua ben Chama of Rabbi Akiva. Fine. That's the end of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah brings this Maimer Muska from Rabbi Akiva. Shekal Hashirim kodesh. All songs, all the ksuvim are kodesh, but Shir Hashirim kodesh kedashim. It's the holiest of all songs. Now, the Mishnah in Yedayim doesn't really say what the shmooze was about. Meaning, what was the machlekes? If it should be Matam Yedayim, it shouldn't be Matam Yedayim. Saiba Keheles or Bashir Hashirim, what was the shmooze? So the Tosefta is Masber by Keheles, that there was a shita amongst the Chachamim that said that Keheles, it says it about Keheles, but L'chaira, learn from there to what the shmooze was about Shir Hashirim, according to the Amrim in the Mishnah that say there was a shmooze about Shir Hashirim, is that they said Keheles is Einei Ela Chachmas Shleima. It's not Nevuah, it's not Torah, it's Chachmas Shleima. And therefore it shouldn't be Matam Yedayim. Now the implication, it sounds like, is if it's Chachmas Shleima and it's not Matam Yedayim, is that it's not from the Kisvei HaKodesh, right? It doesn't have the status of Kisvei HaKodesh. Now, incidentally, this is a machlekes the Chazon Ish and Rav Hai Gaon. The Chazon Ish obviously never saw this tshuva of Rav Hai Gaon. It's published later on. The Chazon Ish in Yedayim and his beer on the Mishnah, the Chazon Ish says that, of course, it was never a shaila that this is Kisvei HaKodesh, and he says, the way he says it is, and someone who learns Shir Hashirim is bevadei mekayim mitzvahs Talmud Torah. It's for sure learning. The only shaila was l'gabe the gzeira of Tumas Yadayim, if that exists or not. But Rav Hai Gaon, in his tshuva about Shir Hashirim, Rav Hai Gaon says that the tzad, that it's not matama Yadayim, held that it wasn't Torah b'chlal. It was ein el chachma shlem avad. So Rav Hai Gaon clearly learned this Mishnah k'pshutei, like the meaning it's either all the way in or all the way out. But the Chazon Ish doesn't learn the Mishnah like that k'pshutei. Now, this is one of the Mishnayos that really belongs in Idias. This is the Mishnayos. This Mishnah says, Amar Reb Shimon ben Azai, Mekobel ani mi ben ship mi pi shivim shv'shtayim zakein b'yom she'yeshiva so v'lazim ben Azari b'yeshiva. Now this is the famous day that the Gemara in Brachas and Daf Chazayin and Aleph describes. The Gemara describes a machlekes between Rav Gamliel and Rav Yeshua. It's a famous Gemara, and Rav Gamliel was deposed. Rav Gamliel was deposed, and they made Rav Elazar ben Azariah the Nasi. We're holding almost by Pesach. It's timely. Made Rav Elazar ben Azariah the Nasi, a young man. And the Gemara says that once Rav Elazar ben Azariah became the Nasi, they opened the doors wide and they let everybody in to come, because Rav Gamliel used to say, "Kol mi she'ein teichi kabaroi al yikanes." Anybody who's not, as sincere and committed inside as he is outside should not enter the Beis Medrash. But Rav Elazar ben Azariah and the Chachamim changed the policy on that day, and they let masses and throngs of Talmidim come in, and it was such a day of Ribui Torah that they were able to be machriya all sorts of sveikis that have been let. Every open folder was closed on that day, and this is one of the open folders that the Mishnah describes was closed on that day. And like the Gemara tells us in Brachas and Daf Chasim at Aleph, that anything that's from that day, we paskin like Ataka, meaning it's anything that's Me'osei Hayom has like a certain kviyas, a certain psak. So this Mishnah Yadayim is from those Mishnayos of Me'osei Hayom, and we're being machriya that Shir Hashirim is Kodesh Kadashim. Now, what exactly that means, Kodesh Kadashim, versus, let's say, other things? So there's many different mahalchim that are given, but the mahalach that appeals to me is that Shir Hashirim, everyone who's seen it, is very it's very physical in its description, right? It's very fleshig with the description. It's not a mashal that's so meaning it almost it has no pashut pshat. Almost pashut pshat you can't read it. It has to be its deeper meaning it must be alluding to something. It's clearly a mashal. So when we say Kol Hashirim Kodesh is because they have a pashut pshat and they also have a mashal. There's things to learn from them. There's midrash chazal, but it also has a pashut pshat. Shir Hashirim, on the other hand, is Kodesh Kadashim. It has no pashut pshat. It's kulei mashal. Now, other pshatim as to why Shir Hashirim is Kodesh is very interesting. The Medrash, I believe it's a psikta and a Pirkei Elazar. The Medrash says that the day that Shir Hashirim, that Shlomo Melech composed Shir Hashirim, was the day that he completed finishing the Beis Hamikdash. Shlomo Melech built the Beis Hamikdash. The day that he completed the Beis Hamikdash, the Medrash describes, Shemayim v'Aretz were totally in sync. There was a total in syncness between Shemayim and Aretz. Everything was perfectly aligned. And when everything was perfectly aligned, Shlomo Melech had this vision of what Kilu HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Korvet Klal Yisrael looks like when everything is perfectly aligned. And what spilled out of him was the psukim of Shir Hashirim, the words of Shir Hashirim. So Shir Hashirim, Kol Hashirim Kodesh, because they have some sort of obfuscation. I'm not even going to try again. Some sort of lack of clarity that there's something that's not klar. It's not perfectly aligned. Everything's not perfectly in place. But Shir Hashirim, which was an expression of Shlomo Melech when everything was perfectly in place, that's Kodesh HaKadashim. Rav Hutner in Pachad Yitzchak on Pesach is marich about this. Pesach is kaidua. There's an earlier minhag to say. We'll talk about in the second Pesach. There's an earlier minhag to say Shir Hashirim than other times. Pesach is the minhag to say Shir Hashirim Pesach by night after the Seder really starts from the Masechta Seifrim. Masechta Seifrim, the earliest minhag from Masechta Seifrim, which is a brisa, says to split it up between the two nights. On the first night of Pesach, you say half of it. Second night of Pesach, you complete the other half. And Lamaisa, that's not the minhag that anymore exists. But to say it on Pesach was mamash time. And again, the reason that was given that the Rishonim were masber is because again, Pesach, a time of Geula, a time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, when Klal Yisrael came out, there was a certain oneness, a certain klarkeit that Klal Yisrael had with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and that's when we say Shir Hashirim. So now, based on that, there are different svarim that wanted to be masber. I think the Likutei Mariach brings this, and the Kaf HaChaim alludes to this, that the Mishnah in Avos says the Asar Dvarim that were Nivru. It's really based on morale. I think the morale is the one who says it the most. But Asar Dvarim Nivru Erev Shabbos Ben Hashmashis, right? There's a whole subcategory of things, and if you look at all of them, they're all kind of like marvelous things. And the Maral in a lot of places is marich about this idea of things that are me'ala teva and things that are teva. And the Maral says that Erev Shabbos ben Hashmashis is like when all the work is done, we're ready to greet Shabbos. That's like a me'ala teva type of time. So based on that, maybe the Maral himself alludes to it, is that Shir Hashirim, which is again something that's Kodesh Kadashim, because it was given in like a, not the way the world usually functions, in a time when everything was clear and everything was aligned. So that's something that you say, Erev Shabbos, ben Hashmashis, is when Shir Hashirim should be said. Now, Ad Kedei Kach, I saw this once. I wasn't able to find the Sefer this week, but I saw this once upon a time. Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef, in Yalkut Yosef, in Reish Ayin, he brings that there was a Shaila once. The Svardim are very makbid to say Shir Hashirim in Shul. There was a Shaila, there was a Rav who wanted to start giving a Shir, I guess a speech, a Shir, whatever, meaning that wasn't the minig, old time by the Svardim, to give a speech Friday night. And there was a Rav who wanted to start giving a speech Friday night, and some of the members of the Kehillah protested. They'd rather say Shir Hashirim B'tzibur than give a Shir, than him give a Shir. And this was a Shaila that was brought to Chacham Ben Zion Abba Shaul to ask him this question. And he held that it was such a Shaila Chamura, like to be mevatel the minig of saying Shir Hashirim during time of Knesses HaShabbos, was such a Shaila Chamura that he wasn't sure what to do. A Shir, L'maisa is a very chashav zach, but he wasn't sure what to do. He went to discuss it with Yehuda Tzadka, who said they should leave it. Stick to Shir Hashirim, don't do anything more. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef brought the Shaila to his father, Bavadia, and Bavadia said that the reason why they have Shir Hashirim as part of the liturgy and not a speech, he says by a speech people waste time. Most people are not listening, they're spacing out, they're schmoozing, they're doing something else. Chach b'Shir Hashirim, if you sing it together b'ne'ima, everybody's clued in. There's nothing else going on in the Mishnah besides davening. And Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef brings a tshuva, I couldn't find it this week, but he brings a tshuva from Moshe Sternbach. It's in Chelik Aleph in Tshuvas Van Haggis, where Moshe Sternbach brings that he heard from the Imrei Emes, or B'Shem the Imrei Emes, that the reason why Sephardic shuls were untouched during the war and all Ashkenazi shuls were destroyed is because the Ashkenazim shul was in shul. Take it or leave it. This is what Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef brings, B'Shem the Imrei Emes, B'Shem Moshe Sternbach, and he says, Memela, there's a big Indian to keep Shir Hashirim as part of the Seder over there, because, what do you say? Similar to Tes Yam. Tes Yam didn't say that, though, that Sephardim shul weren't destroyed. Yeah, but the racist element wasn't there. But he says this, and he says, Memela, it's important to stick to the Shir Hashirim minig and not to have a shir, at that time, right at the Knesses HaShabbos. It's a very auspicious moment. You don't want to waste it, and people are going to be distracted and doing other things. Now, aside from all these different timing that were given as to why we say it Erev Shabbos, there's a fascinating time. It comes from Medrash HaNelam, and I want to be marich a little bit. The Medrash HaNelam just says, it's a one-liner. The Medrash HaNelam says that the minig to say Shir Hashirim Erev Shabbos comes from Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer used to say Shir Hashirim on Erev Shabbos. Now, where we know that from is a fascinating detail, and that's as follows. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, and the Samachas Amud Aleph, brings Rabbi Eliezer is famous. The Gemara in the end of Hazav, right? Rabbi Eliezer has a machlekes with Rabbi Shua about Tanu Shalachnoi. They each bring their rayas. Rabbi Eliezer refuses to back down, and eventually the rest of the Chacham put Rabbi Eliezer in Chayrim, and Rabbi Eliezer is not allowed to base medrash anymore, and he goes home. Now Rabbi Eliezer dies in Chayrim. He never came out of the Chayrim before he died. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Samachas Amud Aleph, describes the terribly sad mu'ura of Rabbi Eliezer Agadol's death. And I just want to read from it a little bit. The Gemara says as follows. It says, Kishachal Rabbi Eliezer, when he fell ill with his final illness, Nichnasu Rabbi Akiva v'chaver of Levakar. Rabbi Akiva and his friends came into Levakar of Eliezer. They were sitting some sort of distance away from him because he was still in Chayrim. They couldn't come too close to him. Underline that. That's an important. Mark that down. The day that Eliezer was on his deathbed was Erev Shabbos. Horkinus, his son, came in to take of his tefillin. Garba, he yelled at him. Okay, then it continues. They came, they sat. Kivin sharo chachamim. They saw that Eliezer was still mamash and zinin. He was still capable. So nichnasu v'yashvu l'fanav b'rachik dalad amas. They came closer to him, but they sat still outside of dalad amas because he was in chayrim. Amalei, he tells them, lama basam. Why are you here? Amalei lama terabanu. We came to learn. Amalei v'ad achshav lama basam. You just found my number. Till now, why didn't you come? Amalei lehaya lanu pnai. We weren't able to make it, and they weren't going to say to his face because you were in chayrim. We weren't allowed. They said lehaya lanu pnai. I don't know, I don't think that any of you are going to die a natural death. Rabbi Akiva says, Shalimao, what's my end? What's my end going to be like? Your death is going to be even harsher than the rest of them. And Rashi explains why. I think Rashi says because Rabbi Akiva was such a keli. Rabbi Eliezer felt that Rabbi Akiva was the most muksher to gain from him, and he stayed away from him. That was, the harshest blow to Rabbi Eliezer. It says, Natal shtei zraisav. Rabbi Eliezer picked up his two hands, v'hinichan alibe, puts them on his heart, and he says, Amar, oilachem shtei zraisav. Woe is to you, my two hands, shem kishtei sifrei Torah. My arms are like two Sifrei Torah, sheniglalin harbe Torah, sheniglalin, that are rolled up, meaning two Sifrei Torah that are unopened, that are untouched. Harbe Torah limadati, v'harbe Torah limadatani, harbe Torah limadati, v'lechasarti mirabayse afilu kekelav amalaklik minayam. I learned everything. I didn't lose a single drop from what my Rebbeim were teaching me. Harbe Torah, and nobody ever came to learn it. El Shani Shaina, he's describing what he knew, what he learned. So, and here is a crazy detail. Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva says to him, after Rabbi Akiva just got the basura that he's going to die, the harshest death of everybody over here, and he sees how embittered and in pain Rabbi Eliezer is, Rabbi Akiva says, Amalei Rabbi Lemadatani. So teach me now. Teach me now. Rabbi Akiva says, I want to learn a little bit now. So they start teaching 300 halachas about this, 300 halachas about this, until finally they were learning some Tyrus, and V'yatzu nishmasi b'Taira, Rabbi Eliezer's neshama goes out as he's saying the word tar, Amar de Rishu al Raglav, Amar Hutar Neder. The Hashirim's over, L'maitzi Shabbos, and they buried him, fine, etc. This is the Gemara in Sanhedrin. Now, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that it was Erev Shabbos. Now, this Gemara is mirrored in the Yerushalmi and Perek Beis of Shabbos. Very similar. There's some Chalukim, and that itself is something that people are busy with. To explain, there's three Chalukim between the way the Yerushalmi says over the story and the way the Bavli says over the story. But in the Zohar, there's more details to the story. In the Zohar, it says as follows. The Zohar in Parshas Vayera says, Tana Rabbanan, Keshachala Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, Hahu Yom Erev Shabbosu. The day that he was sick was Erev Shabbos. V'oisiv liyimini horkenis brei. Okay, then it says they sat down to learn. He says, Bachi Rabbi Akiva cried, V'amar le Rabbi oilef li eraisa. Rabbi, teach me some Torah. Iftach pumei Rabbi Eliezer b'maisa merkava. Rabbi Eliezer started off the session with talking about maisa merkava. Asa v'eschel tavayu. Amru Chachima Shmaminid lesson on Chazian, fine. Okay, then he continues, and he says, they talked about Beheres Aza, which is a sugi in Tyrus, and then he continues and he says, V'oilufle Rabbi Eliezer, time in the psuki the Shir Hashirim. Rabbi Eliezer starts teaching Rabbi Akiva the timing of the psukim of Shir Hashirim. V'have'eni the Rabbi Akiva nachach maya. Rabbi Akiva was crying from the intensity of the lesson that he was getting. V'ischazer also ki kadmaisa kadmatalai psuka samchuni ba'ashishis. When they got to the pasuk of samchuni ba'ashishis, v'gomer la'yachal mizvun Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva could not be civil anymore. V'arim kalib b'chiyasa. He started crying. V'goy. He was crying and wailing. V'levim emalami d'chilu d'shchinta d'havet hamon. He couldn't settle down from the fear of the shechina that was present over there. Oyri le'kol ha'miktav v'razin ilo d'havet be'ei b'shir Hashirim. Rabbi Eliezer taught Rabbi Akiva all the secrets and the seidis that are hidden in Shir Hashirim. Fine, okay, and the Zohar is ma'arich even more with specific psukim that he got up to, and etc. Now, from here, I was reading from Reuven Margolius Hayam, in brackets, and it's not his own. This really comes from the Medrash Hanelam. He says, "Mikan mekar la'amir shir shirim b'erev Shabbos." This story that Chazal spent, a lot of time between the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, the Zohar describing, is the makar, or one of possibly the original makar for saying and being busy with Shir Hashirim, Erev Shabbos ben Hashmashas. Rabbi Eliezer, it seems, his minig was to always, and during this very consequential murah where he met Rabbi Akiva, and he was teaching Rabbi Akiva, with his dying breaths, say the Satira, it was about Shir Hashirim. So from here is the makar to say Shir Hashirim, Erev Shabbos ben Hashmashas, is because that's the time that Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol said it. That's the time that Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol made this great transmission, this great deposit of Torah to Rabbi Akiva during that time. Now, just to end off with some light stories, the light-ish stories. Reb Menachem Mendel of Shklov, the Goyen's Talmud, his wife said over after he died that she once went into his room. She told us to the Chaver Kadisha. It's brought down in the Sefer Toldos Chachmei Yerushalayim, but that she told the Chaver Kadisha when he died that she once went into his room Erev Shabbos while he was saying Shir Hashirim. He was all Nachan Mikveh, in his big Shabbos, sitting in his room, and he's saying Shir Hashirim, and she said, she saw him learning Shir Hashirim together with someone else, and she said to him, she asked him, "Who's your Shir Hashirim chavrusa? Who are you learning with?" And he said, "You saw my chavrusa?" She says, "Yeah, I was you're a very chashuva lady," and he wasn't ma'arich more. So you draw your own conclusions. Who Shir Hashirim chavrusa was? Another in the Chassidish world is like a mirror story. The Tzvi Yashiv Ziddichayev used to say that he once went to hear Shir Hashirim from his Rebbe Baruch of Mezbush. He hid in a closet. He went with the Chavrusa, and very similar description of like the fire and the intensity, almost like mirroring Rabbi Akiva's experience with Rebbe Lazar, is how the Zidicheva describes his experience, hearing his Rebbe Baruch of Mezbush Shir Hashirim. Now, there's just one other story that's interesting. There's a story. It's brought. Rabbi Ari Levine used to say it over, but it has like a whole chain of Messiah of who said it over first. That Rav Nachumke, the Chavetz Chaim's Rebbe, one time on one Erev Shabbos, he had some guests in his house, some chashuv guests that he planned to attend to, but he was asuk with settling a bunch of Jewish soldiers who had just come to town that needed accommodations for Shabbos, needed a place to stay, where to eat, and by the time he got home, it was several hours into Shabbos already, and he felt bad for his chashuv guest who was sitting waiting for him, and he wanted to make him feel better, to mifayis him. And he told him as follows. He says, I'm going to tell you about the minig of Rav Alexander Ziskin, the Baal Yisai V'Sher Shavayda, what his minig in Erev Shabbos was. He says he would sit Erev Shabbos, Hayitayvel b'mikvah, v'roichet panav yadav v'raglav, v'loivish bigdi loven shel Shabbos, he wore white clothing for Shabbos, v'haylach lebeis HaKnesses, k'shabiyada Megillah Shir Hashirim k'sheira, he would take a kosher of Megillah Shir Hashirim b'yada, shenichtav k'may sefer Torah, v'hu atzmei kasava, was something that he himself wrote, v'yikayra Shir Hashirim b'mesinus, b'mesikas gedolah b'slahavas u'b'dveikas neira. He would read it mamish with a sweetness and a dveikus and a sincerity in shul. He says, "V'himshach Rav Nachum v'amar." And this is Rabbi Levine used to be Mosif. Rav Nachum told over to his guest. He says, "Kabbalah b'yadeinu me'avesenu, shemalchei maila, and shemayim the malachim v'yapoiskin milemer shira." They would pause what they were doing, saying shira v'hayimdun shaymin u'makshivim l'kol ne'imas amir shir shirim shalai. They would pause and they would pay attention to the Yisei Shir Shavayda. This is amir of shir shirim. Shaya bekei rikim. It was splitting the heavens. He says, and then Rav Nachum finished off and he said, "Kol ze b'deiris kaidmim." Says this was all in Deir Sekadmainim. The Yisei Shir Shavayda did not have to be busy with soldiers, he says. So he was able to do this Meridik Shir Hashirim. But B'Deirenu, he says, Muftachani, I guarantee you, Shehagoyin HaKadosh Bal Yisei Shir Shavayda Schus Yagen Aleinu, Lo Yoyim Mahasis Af L'Rega, he wouldn't have hesitated for a second. V'Oiziv Amir Shir Hashirim Shaloyim, U'Mizdariz Lahatzel Nafshe Shechayal Yehudi Achar Hazakuk L'Kach. So this is a Shai Graucher, you say the Shir Shavayda. Rav Nachum says that it's Pashatim, after he described the Yisei the Shir Shavayda's, heaven splitting Amir Shir Hashirim, he says it's Pashat Rav Nachum could have dropped it in an instant to go help these soldiers who needed a place to stay for Shabbos. Okay, Taif, to be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.